I'm Father Lampy.
And I'm Father Schumacher. And we are the Associates.
Welcome to another episode of Ask the Associates.
Today we'll be discussing a topic that parents might want to screen for their children ahead of time, just to let you know. So, here's a question, Father.
Okay.
Someone asks, are there any restrictions in a marital sex life, according to Catholic teaching?
Well, that's an interesting question. So we have to first establish some principles of Christian morality. We are bodies and souls. What we do with our bodies affects our souls, and what's going on in our souls has an effect on our bodies. So in the marital embrace, we are expressing the full gift of self to another human being. And so it's not just seeking pleasure or doing things with the body, it's the whole person that should be participating in this action. And so when husband and wife come together in the marital embrace, it means that they are consummating or bringing to completion this gift of self that they've promised, that they've started, that has taken place at their wedding. That being said, are there any kinds of things that can be done that would be problematic or difficult or inappropriate? Anything that would degrade the dignity of the human person would be inappropriate, even in the context of marriage. We need to treat each other with dignity and respect, recognizing that we are not simply objects or things for pleasure for other people, but we are people ourselves, and we need to have our dignity respected. So even in the context of marriage, husband and wife, whatever is being done needs to be providing for that dignity and respect between the couples. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, maybe it's useful to start with what is the purpose of human sexuality? I think the question kind of indicates they're already asking about a marital sexual intercourse and sexual congress. So, we're already presuming that we're in the context that the Church foresees, because God created it this way, for the human sexual act. But it's good to remind ourselves of what the purpose of that act is just in general. God created humans as sexual beings as a way to express the fact that they're created in the image of God, and therefore humans are life-giving in an imitation of the way that God is life-giving. And they're precisely life-giving by means of an act of love, an act that goes outside of itself. When I do various activities, I am frequently acting in my own self-interest. But love is an activity that is for someone else's interest. Love, strictly speaking, is to will the good of another. Charity is to will the good of another. This is lived out in a very beautiful expression of God's creation in marriage, that two different people who have two individual interests come together to create a family. And their family then is also life-giving in the procreation of children. And as we know, procreation doesn't involve just the begetting of children, but also the raising of them and the education of them. It's the whole process. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why marriage is necessary, because human beings are not ready to live adult lives when they're first born. The stability of a family is necessary to human development. And that means that the purpose of human sexuality is primarily for procreation. God, in his wisdom, also created it so that the very thing that is the process by which new humans are created, the propagation of the species, the preservation of the species, is also the thing that, better than anything else, unites husband and wife as a couple, as a pair that are united in a family for life. It's wonderful providence. Perhaps you've never thought of that God didn't have to create it that way. The thing that makes more humans could have been entirely separate from the thing that unites people in an affective relationship. So those two things go together. You've probably heard of the procreative and the unitive purposes or ends of marriage and of the sexual act. So these things can never be separated, and that helps us to get to some of the practicals here. Any sexual act that would separate the procreative end or the unitive end from the sexual act is, by its very nature, contrary to God's purpose for marriage. So you can come up with examples of that. Things that would be inappropriate are things that either prevent procreation or things that prevent union. So different acts that you can that would be involved in the sexual sphere are forbidden in that way, not because of the church's law, but because of the way God designed us to be and the way He designed our sexuality.
So notice in the clarification, He didn't say anything about pleasure. So that's not one of the ends. It's kind of like a bonus. But the end or the purpose, as has already been said, is procreation and union. But pleasure and union are not the same thing. So some people would do acts that could be pleasurable, but aren't actually bringing about a union and are opposed to or could not possibly lead to procreation. And such acts that may be bringing pleasure but not ordered towards those ends are acts that are inappropriate even in the context of marriage.
All right, so let's get to some of the practical questions about this then. So let's say, for example, a married couple, they're married, has had some kind of infertility problem or sterilization even, maybe even a non-reversible sterilization. Does that preclude then, if the primary purpose of marriage, the primary end of marriage and the marital act is procreation, what bearing does that have on this question?
Well, with regards to sterilization, that is morally unacceptable because we are always supposed to be open to life. In sacred scripture, having children is always seen as a gift, a benefit, a blessing from God. And so we shouldn't be rejecting these gifts deliberately, intentionally preventing them from happening through contraception or sterilization. But in some cases, for good reasons, a person may need to avoid for a period of time having children, in which case there's natural family planning to pursue that. Which still respects the dignity of the human person, God's plan for marriage, and things of that order. But more specifically to your question, what about like the infertile couple? Well, it's the act itself that we're trying to talk about. So a couple that's infertile, incapable of having children despite their efforts of engaging in the marital act, and they're aware of that, the act itself, though, is still ordered towards procreation. And through no fault of their own, whether or not it results in a child is not something that they are morally culpable for. But if they are intentionally trying to prevent it, that would be a moral decision that's being made. Again, through contraception or sterilization. But if they're infertile for natural reasons, that's not their fault, and they can still engage in the marital act. There is different methods that are acceptable in the church. Things that are natural, things that assist the body or heal the body to enable to cure infertility is acceptable. Things that go around or outside the body, such as in vitro fertilization, is no longer following the dignity and respect of the couple and their love and their marriage. So we want to make sure that we're respecting these things and keeping them in the proper order. Anything you'd like to add? Yeah, so on the question of sterilization, as Father said, the deliberate sterilizing of a human person is a grave offense against that person's sexual dignity. And to do it in order to not have children is a grave sin. However, we priests are well aware that sometimes people did this and then come to realize that they ought not to have done that, or they come to a conversion on this matter, or and yet there might not be anything they can do to reverse it. So what then? I think the answer there, again, as you say, would be to come to the Lord with a penitent heart, recognizing, I wish I hadn't done this. And yet, the sexual act itself in that case, just like it would be for an infertile couple, is still open to life, despite the fact that that the bodies themselves are no longer capable of that. So a couple that has had a sterilization doesn't commit sin by then engaging in sexual intercourse. However, it might be appropriate to do some kind of ongoing penance as a sign that you really are sorry for this and that you're not gaining some kind of illicit benefit, as it were. That sin that you committed at some earlier time doesn't have any hold on your heart. Imagine, say, for example, someone who had committed a theft or a robbery. He might turn out later to be sorry for that. What he might do would be to deliberately give back the thing that he had stolen in order to make sure that that didn't have some kind of spiritual hold on his heart.
a similar kind of parallel case would be here, that you've gained something that you used to want, and now maybe you don't want it anymore. So some kind of ongoing penitential act would maybe be appropriate in this case, to show God that you really are sorry for having committed this, and you've come to a deeper conversion on this matter.
Some sterilizations are reversible, and in which case there is an encouragement but not a requirement to seek that reversal.
Another question then, Father, this leads us to the question of intimacy. So let's say it has become actually impossible to pursue normal sexual relations, normal sexual intercourse, through, say, bodily weakness or whatever else, right? What happens then? What is the role of human sexuality in the life of a couple in this situation?
That's a good question. Well, all of us seek intimacy. We want to know and be known. We want to love and be loved. We want to have that connection with the other person. As we had said earlier, love is willing the good of the other. And there are different ways of expressing love. Yes, of course, sexual intimacy is one way, but we can still express love through our bodies to each other in other ways. There's a theory called the 5 love languages. And the theory is that all forms of expression of love can be reduced down to these 5 different categories. One of them would be affection, in which that would include sexual intimacy. But other forms of affection can still take place there too. Kissing, hugging, snuggling, things like that. But there's also other things, such as gift giving. Some people recognize that when they receive a gift, that's a true expression of love. Services, having things done for each other, doing things for each other, is another way that love can be expressed and received. Spending quality time together, having deep, meaningful conversations, doing things together, and just spending time is a way that some people can really connect and understand this person cares, that they do appreciate me because they're making a gift of their time to me. And then
words of affirmation.
Words of affirmation, yes. It's kind of interesting that I forgot that one. It's one of the top ones for me. Words of affirmation, telling people, I love you, I care about you, you are important to me, can be very moving to a person. So it's good for us to be aware of our own love languages. How do we receive love? As I just mentioned, one of them for me is words of affirmation, telling me good job and we care about you and things like that. How do we express love? How do we like to express love? The way we receive may not always be the same that we like to express it. If we know what our love language is for reception and for giving, and we know what another person's is, then we can express love in an appropriate way through these different languages, and that message of love can still be received, even if it's not necessarily being done in the context of marriage through the sexual act.
Yeah, this is kind of the advice I give to people who ask me this question individually, is you can imagine, say, a situation down the line or in another circumstance in which you are no longer having sexual intercourse with your spouse. Does that mean that you cease to be married? Person would usually say, of course not. And then I would come back with, so what does that mean? What does it mean still to be married at that point? And I think maybe if you didn't have the tools to express it, as Father's expressed it so nicely here, you wouldn't necessarily be able to come up with that. But you have an intuitive grasp that the purpose of marriage is not just sexual intercourse, that it's an intercourse of life. It's a way of living together and being a family. And then people ask the question, so how do we do that? And Father has kind of delineated some of these different categories of the love languages and the modes of expression of that love. That can be a helpful tool here. Although I do want to acknowledge also that the loss of the sexual intimacy is a great loss. God intended us to have that sexual union. And so as we lose that ability or lose the occasion or whatever the circumstance is, I don't want to pretend that that's just nothing. You just pick up some other way. No, certainly not. And yet there is, in God's providence and wisdom, there are other ways for us to express our love and affection for each other. Next question, kind of related to this one.
Okay.
So another person asks, can you discuss the church's views on masturbation? And he goes on to say, I see this is on the confession list, the examination of conscience, and I wonder why it's a sin. He says the doctors recommend masturbation for stress relief, so why does the church consider it a sin?
Well, that's a good question. So if we go back to the principles we've already mentioned, What is the purpose of sexual union and these bodily organs? Like, they have an end, and that end that is ordered towards procreation. It can also be through the coming together of husband and wife, an example of union. So we have these ends of the act. But masturbation doesn't include another person, and it's not ordered towards procreation. And so because it's separate and devoid of these ends, it is morally unacceptable. Additionally, it teaches a person to focus inwardly, which is contrary to love, which we had said is about willing the good of the other. But if a person is constantly indulging in their own pleasures, then they're not ordered towards the other, they're ordered towards self. And then when a person continues down that strain, they make it more and more difficult to actually love, because they've formed themselves in this manner of selfishness and not in this manner of love ordered towards the other and the good of the other. Instead, it's inward towards self.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, that it's a fundamentally selfish act, and I mean that in the technical sense. It's directed towards self. God created us, as St. John Paul said so clearly. He made us for others. He made us for gift of self to others. Masturbation is an act that deliberately removes the other from the human sexual realm. You can see in a philosophical sense, in a principled sense, it kind of is removing this gift of self. But we also want to look at the fact that maybe a parallel example would be helpful, right? If, as Father's saying, if you're always kind of focused on gratifying personal pleasure, you actually kind of lose your grip on reality, the real world out there, if you want to think of it that way. A parallel example might be drug use, for example. And the reason I'm choosing that one is because, in a certain sense, if we just have bodies and they have, neuroreceptors and, whatever, then why don't I just, if I find some chemical that turns on the switch for pleasure, what's bad about doing that, right? I mean, like, if I get pleasure from going on a run or from watching a movie, then what's so bad about, finding a chemical that I put in my body and it does the same thing? Well, the reason is because it actually changes the way you interact with reality. It's taking the body and abusing, in the strict sense, it's abusing the faculty. It's abusing the way we were made. God created these things to have interactions with real things in the world. And it is possible, yes, with technological means to kind of take them for your own purposes. And yet that destroys the integral unity of the whole there. And it's easy to see with things like drug use. Masturbation would be a parallel example, because it's taking this faculty and making it devoid of all of its ordinary context and content, and taking just the one thing that an individual has decided that he wants in this case. It actually destroys the created order in that way, and in that way it's an offense against the Creator. Masturbation is a very grave sin against the sexual order, which is God's own plan for the human race and for our interaction as a species.
So going back to that point about the doctors, not all doctors follow the same moral teaching or have the same understanding of the human person in that integration of body and soul that the Catholic Church has and has maintained throughout the years. So some doctors may think, oh, well, this is a great source of stress relief, for example, failing to recognize the spiritual, the psychological, the mental effects that it has on the human person and what it does to sexual morality. So some doctors will recommend things that are completely contrary to that of the faith. That's why it's important for us as faithful Catholics to find doctors who believe in the teachings of the Church, who follow sexual morality as the Church provides it, so as to maintain that proper dignity and respect of all human life and of God's created order.
At the end here, we've got some resources that you might be able to find in the description of this video if you want some more information about this topic.
It's important for you to like and subscribe so that you can get updates to Ask the Associates. And so you can click on the subscribe button below.
New episodes come out every Wednesday.